Peter Istvan, speaking to you from the small city of, or town rather, of Parry Sound, Ontario. So Parry Sound is located about 2 hours north of Toronto, in affectionately called Cottage Country. There's the largest archipelago. I'm not sure if it's the largest archipelago in the world, but certainly it's a large one, where there's 30,000 islands. So it's a very popular place in the summer for people coming from Toronto because of all the lakes, and people have summer homes and cottages and things like that. So I grew up in Toronto, and as for as long as I can remember, my dad always had a camera around him. His occupation was he was a physician, obstetrician, gynecologist, but his hobby was, which at the time, well, it was a hobby, was photography. And I still remember very well with excitement when he would come home with the new slides. I'm really dating myself, but slides. And one of my jobs was to run around and grab the screen that we set up in our living room, and projector. And then, of course, there was always the stress of making sure that the slides were put in the upside the right way, so when they projected out on the screen, they were the right side up. But so I think it's probably through my dad that I became interested in photography. And as long as I can remember, I've had a camera of some kind taking photos. I seem to have gravitated towards taking pictures of people. Even if I think of some of my early photographs way back when, I was interested in people and capturing them in a moment that would be expressive of the time, their personality, and what they were experiencing at the time. So try and capture that in a moment. I mean, I certainly like taking pictures of animals too, but it's just different technology. But I think I certainly gravitate towards people. And then also over more recent years, people in an action. So for example, my daughter's ski team, I really enjoyed. I don't know if she enjoyed it, but I enjoyed following her around and taking pictures at the meets that she competed at, or some of the local bike events that we have here in Parry Sound. So it's capturing those action shots were always exciting as well. But it's people in either still or just talking, or in action, I certainly gravitate towards. This provides a wonderful place to, as the expression goes, to live, work, and play. And through the 4 seasons, I was just chatting with someone just a few minutes before we got started this interview, but we just love the 4. We have the 4 distinct seasons here in Parry Sound, and just with each one comes some new kind of joy. But spring is particularly an energizing season, with everything growing or starting to grow, and just longer days in the winters. So, I mean, summertime is just filled with great summer days by the beach or in the water. And as I mentioned, one of the reasons it's such a popular place up here is because of all the different islands that people can explore right on Georgian Bay. But then also there's so many just lakes where people have their cottages. But winter brings a whole other sort of exciting element to living in Parry Sound that is enjoyed by cross-country skiing. We have some fantastic ski trail system, as well as fat biking. So fat biking is on a bike with larger tires and there's great trails to groom, and just really embracing what the winter can offer. And snow, I don't do it, but a lot of people do snowmobiling as well. So with each season living up here in Parry Sound, we can experience nature at its finest, whether it be the winter season or the trees, or in the summertime, but it's just full of vibrancy through each season as we go through the year, which makes it a great place to live. Photography for me is something I've been doing for quite some time, but it's currently a side business that I put 150% passion into it because I enjoy it so much. And over the next couple of years, I can certainly see it evolving into perhaps just a full-time thing that I am engaged with. In the field of photography, obviously there's different things that a photographer can focus on or get involved with. Weddings, for example, family portraits, pet photography, boudoir photography, real estate. I mean, there's a long list of different aspects of photography that a photographer can do. And some photographers do all of them, for sure. So what I focus on is headshots. So typically from your chest up, as you've seen and probably will show. And I mean, some people absolutely just need a headshot for whatever. Maybe it's for the website, maybe it's for their marketing brochure, for their business card or whatever. And it's just it's just like going to the dentist. They need a headshot. They got to go get their teeth clean. And that's it. However, for some, it's really, and what really makes it exciting for me, is the transformative effect that having a good photo of someone can have. So I'll give you an example. And this doesn't happen for every client by any stretch, but it happens for enough that makes it's sort of like golf. If you hit a good shot and keep golfing, despite the fact I'm a hacker, but this one good shot keeps me going. So in photography, so there's one client I had not too long ago, and she was going through a lot of life changes. She had just ended doesn't sound like a very good relationship. She had moved to a new part of Ontario. She started a new job, and part of what she wanted to do was evolving and growing herself into a different part of her time of her life. And one of those was capturing herself in a photo. What was really amazing about this experience that I had with her is one of her hands had a deformity that she was born with. And she said, if there's a way I can incorporate this hand in the photo sometime, then that would be great. So at the time I said, sure, not really knowing what that would look like. And we started the process that I have, and we went through a bunch of different poses and expressions and had some good laughs along the way. She had a great sense of humor. That helps. And at one point, she just started adjusting her hair, not my hair, obviously her hair, with her hand that had this deformity. And I started capturing some photos, and they turned to be really very natural photos of her having her hand in the photo. And then, I mean, it may not sound funny now, but at the time it was sort of a fun thing where I said, okay, well, give me the finger, right? And so she did this with her good hand, and then I said, no, the other one. And we just had a great, powerful moment when she was holding up her hand that had this deformity, but she was, giving me the finger. And then after the process, or after the photo shoot, when we had taken enough photos, we go through a selection process. And at the very end, she said, this was one of the most empowering experiences I've had in a long time. And I'm just very grateful for that. And she also said that, this is the first time I've allowed somebody to take a photo of her hand. That kind of experience, when I first got into headshot photography, I was attracted to the images, but that part of being able to help someone or transform in just a small little way their confidence in themselves, to feel good about themselves, was a pretty incredible experience for me. Thankfully, I've got a great series of mentors to help me. And I certainly followed with one of probably the greatest headshot photographers, Peter Hurley, who's based out in New York. And one of his expressions, it goes something like, I aim for the face, but I shoot for the heart when he's taking a photo. And it brings to light the purpose of most of the headshot sessions. And it really is being able to connect with someone. Generally speaking, most people do not like having their photo taken. They don't like standing in front of camera. They think they're going to break the camera. They don't like anything on their faces, because people spend a lot of time in front of the mirror looking, and it's just not a pleasant. They just don't want to do it. So being able to connect with someone in a very short time, because it's not like I have a lot of time to get to know someone before, but being able to have a real connection with them in a meaningful way to create an image that ultimately they need to be happy with it. I mean, I like images for different reasons, but they need to be the ones who really like it. And, that's a reflection if they share it, for example. If they get to a point where they're comfortable enough to share it, then that's great. But then they don't necessarily have to share it, but it's just that transformative effect. It just came to mind another example. I had a client, part of the process is I take some photos and I'm hooked up to a laptop, and all that means is that I can bring them around and I can show them the photos that we're capturing. Well, I had taken maybe about 10 photos with this client, and then I brought her around and said, hey, come look what we're capturing. She came over, she stared at it for a moment, and then she literally burst out in tears. And I was a little confused at the moment because I thought she was, oh my God, she hates these photos, but she couldn't believe what she looked like with, some proper lighting and good photo. And it was just this little transformative moment that I had with this client, which was, it's special. It's part of that. To make someone feel comfortable enough to tell you what's up with them in the role of a physician. But then as a physician, you're trying to get to a diagnosis probably faster. I'm not trying to get to a diagnosis when I'm trying to take a headshot of someone. I'm just trying to get to know them. So it's connecting with them. At the end of the day, it's just communication and asking questions and showing genuine interest in them, their story, the things they're talking about. If I don't know them, because I live in a small town, certainly sometimes I know people either directly or indirectly. But if someone came to my studio that I've never met before, there is some initial communication via email, so I get to know them a little bit. But it's sitting down and just chatting with them. It's not come in here, stand behind me, and we start taking photos. It's just spending maybe 5-10 minutes just talking to them a little bit, getting to know them, and connecting with them from one human being to another human being, and just to get them to relax a little bit and feel comfortable with me. They're probably not going to feel comfortable without taking photos. As I said earlier, a lot of people don't like taking or having their photo taken, but the good news is I love taking photos, so we cancel each other out. So it usually results in a very positive experience for people. Yeah, I'll just, it's sort of a booth, but it's my setup. I have 3 different lights. It's not really a booth per se, but there's 3 different flashes that flash on that I set up in a triangle kind of setup when I'm taking photos. And what it does is it hits them with a person with a wave of light. And then, light is, you can create any kind of photo with light, depending on how you set it up, things like that. But for the images that perhaps you've seen on my website, there's 3 lights set up. So when I press the shutter, 3 flashes go off, and there's a wave of beautiful light that makes people look awesome. Going to take me, well, it's going to continue for years and years and years. So it's not like I've arrived. I've arrived at a point where at least I feel pretty confident being able to take a good photo with someone. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm associated with Peter Hurley's, and he has a group called Headshot Photographers, which are photographers connected throughout the world, actually, which has been great. So it provides a great opportunity for me to learn from other photographers. So through that network, I spent a lot of time talking, learning, watching, listening, and just surround myself with people who have the knowledge and are willing to help. And that's been a great, fortunately for me, great opportunity to embrace the education experience of others. So to answer your question specifically, I got more into headshot photography, I guess it was around 2018. So I've been working on it since then, and it's just something I continue to work on. And while you can't see in my studio, but I have this fake head on that. Well, it's either I'm taking a lot of selfies because not in the sense of being vain, but just to practice the lighting, to practice the little tweaks, to practice the editing. And it's consistent ever over years, and to get me to this point. But it's not like I've arrived. I have a lot more to go, for sure. The equipment, it helps, but I mean, you can create amazing. I mean, look at how good the cameras on our phones are. And you know, going back to something I said earlier, it's not necessarily the equipment that captures the magic in a photo. It's the ability to connect with a person. So, you know, a few years ago, locally, I was asked, just as a little side story, there was a group putting on they're putting on "Show Us Your Best Winter Photos." It was just an evening to celebrate, and they invited about 5 photographers to share their best images. And when I started going through that, okay, what are my best images? It's actually started to become a very perplexing question for me, because it depends. Like, there's some images that are technically, and by technically, I mean like exposure, lighting, color, or whatever, are terrible. But because it's a photo of, let's say, my grandmother, it's a really special photo. Or if there's a photo, you know, I'm just thinking some of the photos of a picture of a bunch of kids, they're laughing, they're smiling. Again, maybe not the best technical photo, but the joy and the vibrancy that you can feel from looking at that photo makes it an awesome photo. So it is a little bit of the perception of who's actually looking at the photo. Is it a good photo? So this is a long-winded answer to your question about the lenses in the portrait. It really is less about the equipment, because anybody can, I mean, really anybody can take a good photo with good equipment, but it's more about creating the story behind the photo, which is where the art is really in the photography. It's not, you know, do you have a 50 mil zoom lens or whatever? It's really the everything behind it that creates the awesome image for people to look at. I got more into the business side of photography by helping a friend do weddings. A few years ago, I was called what's second shooter. So second shooter just means she was a primary photographer. I mean, she was the one dealing with her clients, getting paid, and I would just go and help her for fun. So I would lug her equipment around, and once it was set up, then I could take some candid photos. I would never want, I mean, hats off to any wedding photographer out there, because that is a difficult gig to do. And that's something I'm not interested in doing myself, but I have been involved with them, but just as in that role as a second shooter. How did I get to bees? Well, I blame my friend Cam, because it was about 8 years ago now. One summer he said, "Hey, you should get bees." All right. All right. I didn't know what that meant. I mean, I knew what it meant, but it was like, oh, okay, sure, I'll try that. So it was really just on a whim that a friend of mine introduced me to beekeeping. And that summer, I think it was about 8 years ago, started. I remember it was on July 1st, so Canada's national holiday, because that was the day I could pick up the bees from. So getting bees, to get started, there's a couple different ways, but one of them is essentially going to like a pet store for bees, where you get a box that's really, you know, it's about 1.5 feet by, I don't know, 5 or 6 inches. And in that, there's frames, which you may have seen some of the photos of. So we call those square things frames. And when you buy your first set of bees, you get 4 of those frames. There's about 3,000 live bees on there. And then there's a bunch of unborn bees. And then there's some honey in the frames. And then there's one queen bee. And that's what gets you started into beekeeping. And so that's been an incredible journey in itself, being involved with beekeeping. And it's been a lot of fun. But that's how I got started, through a friend. They don't follow plans too well. So I've used a couple of different techniques for them, and there's some pretty fascinating techniques that other photographers have shown. But I mean, really just standing out in front of the hive, just thinking about the lighting. I mean, primarily where the sun is and how it's hitting the hive or not hitting the hive. And then at different times of the day, there's different activity, getting to know the bees in that way. The different activities. Often, I mean, many of the photos, sometimes it's just, as I mentioned earlier, cell phones are pretty good. So during a bee inspection, I'll pull out my cell phone and just take a couple of photos just to capture what I'm seeing, so I can help me remember something later. I like taking photos of the queen bee when you see her. That's not always the case when you're opening up a hive. But so it's not that complicated, but it's been fun to capture bees for sure. Yes, so bees are very good about finding food. They have about they fly typically from their hive, so those boxes. Generally, their range is about 3 to 5 kilometers, so that they would go foraging for food. In At this time of year, March being where we live in Parry Sound, they'll actually start bringing back pollen from some of the things that first start budding, like maple trees or pussy willows and things like that. But to answer your question, in the winter, so it depends. When you ask that question, you got to make sure it depends on where you are in the world. So here in Parry Sound in the north and most of Ontario, what we do in the fall, there's a couple of things that happen in beekeeping, and some of this may or may not be interesting. But one of the things that the hive does, so the hive being all the bees, in about late September, October, in preparation for the winter, because they know winter is coming too, they start kicking out all the male bees. So in a beehive, there's 3 main bees. And just to give you some numbers here, in a full hive in the summer, there's 1 queen bee. There's always just 1 queen bee. Generally, there's reasons there may be more than one, but there's 1 queen bee. There's 50 to 60,000 female bees, and then there's about 2 to 3,000 male bees. So we call the male bees or drones. So back to October, what happens is the hive starts kicking out the male bees, and literally it's kicking them out to their death, because they're not going to survive over the winter outside of the hive. So why do they do that? Well, they do that because the male bees they actually don't do much in the hive. Their sole function in the world of beekeeping is to mate with a queen. So the hive, from the hive's perspective, this is a resource issue, that they don't want the males around in the hive during the winter eating up their honey. So out they go, and they go to their death. Now, another thing that commonly beekeepers in this area, and again, just emphasizing that in this area, Ontario, we feed our bees some sugar water during the fall. So why do we do that? Well, that's just to help increase the stores of the honey that they have in their hives. I mean, bees are making the honey not for us as humans. I mean, we enjoy that a lot, but they're making it as their food source. So bees eat primarily 2 things: the honey, which is their carbohydrate, and then pollen, which they collect as their protein. So we feed them in late September, October. We start feeding them a lot of, or not everybody, but some people do, myself included, start feeding them sugar water, and usually a 2-to-1 ratio. And that allows the bees to convert that quickly to a honey source. So honey is a result, you're familiar with maple syrup likely. So at this time of year is a great time for maple syrup. People, where they're harvesting sap from maple trees, and you may recall the sap from maple trees has to be boiled down from a 40-to-1 ratio. So similarly, bees they're not collecting honey from flowers, obviously, they're collecting nectar. They bring it back to the hive, and then they have to go through the nectar has to go through an evaporation process, essentially, to reduce it down to about a 17-18% water content, and that's when it's honey. And so when we feed them sugar water at a 2-to-1 ratio, and that just speeds up that process for them to convert it to honey. So then during the winter, there's a couple other things we do. We wrap them, and that's really more to provide a windbreak from the minus 20 winds, or can be. But what happens in the hive itself, if you can imagine, it's like the March of the Penguins. There's a ball of bees in the hive. And so in the center of that ball is the queen bee. And what the rest of the hives are doing, or what the rest of the bees, are doing, is much like you and I, if we get cold, we shiver. And why we shiver? We shiver to generate heat. So what the other bees are doing is they're shivering, and because of the way their anatomy is, that their wings are slightly detached, or the connection to their thorax is they can vibrate or shiver their thorax muscles, and the purpose is to generate heat. and the heat keeps the queen warm. So when it's minus 30 Celsius outside in Parry Sound, right around the queen, it's plus 30 Celsius, and that's how they keep her warm. So they don't. So the bees here, they don't fly south for the hibernate in Florida. They don't hibernate and go to sleep, but they're actively. I mean, it's a fight for survival, basically. And as you can imagine, this ball of queen or the ball of bees, the outside ones, I mean, they're die just because they can't stay warm enough. And so it's a fight for survival during the winter. I mean, a couple of things that factors into that. A, there has to be enough honey for them to get through the winter, because that's their food source. And there has to be enough bees in that initial ball going into the summer, into the winter, where that they can sustain the amount of natural death that's going to happen. And it's quite a remarkable thing on a warm winter day. Most typically in January or February, if the sun is out, it's really kind of above zero. What you'll see in front of your hive is another reason why probably know the expression "don't eat yellow snow," because the bees, they'll exit and they'll go to the bathroom and they'll take this opportunity. So at this one time, I remember in particular, I went out just looking, and it was like the snow had turned yellow. And so the reason they do that is because they tend not to go to the bathroom in their hive. They wait, they hold it, they wait literally, and they go flying out on these warm winter days and go in the hive. So that poses a problem if it's a really cold, long winter, because they don't go out and do that. And then there's been reports of bees dying of dysentery because they can't go to the bathroom. So going into the winter is it's not the best time for beekeeping. So what we do is going back to all those sort of things I mentioned, come November, we've wrapped them, we've given them enough food, and then we just really cross our fingers and hope for the best over the next, because you can't really do any interventions over the winter. I guess you could, but it usually wouldn't end out well, where you open the hive, for example, and feed it something, because what potentially could happen is they get into this ball formation that I mentioned. And if you open up the hive, let's say on Christmas Day, the bees are going to get all confused about that, potentially. And then what'll happen is they'll break that ball, it'll break sort of the pattern they're used to, and then likely it's just going to die. So again, here in Ontario, where I live, we wrap them in November, and then it's only about now that we start potentially looking in. So at this time of year, March, what we could do is we could start feeding them again, just to give them an initial food source for the next couple of weeks. Because this is a bit of a dicey time as well, because we haven't had a couple warm days, so the bees kind of wake up a little bit more, so to speak, and hey, maybe spring is coming. But then we'll get a few more really cold days, and then there's no food around, because not much, or at least right now is today, April 9th. We haven't had too much blooming yet because we had a long cold winter. So this time again is a little dicey. So it's a little better when for example, the dandelions start blooming. That's a good sign that things are okay. So that was a long answer to your question of what happens in the winter. They die. And so then you might think, well, then how do we get male bees around here? Well, so just to talk a little bit about that, the queen bee, in her abdomen, she has she's got a longer abdomen, and hopefully some of the photos that I sent you, you'll see she's got a little longer abdomen. And so in there's two sacs. One has sperm, one has eggs. So when she has the ability to lay an unfertilized egg or a fertilized egg. The unfertilized egg turns into a male bee, and the fertilized egg turns into a female bee. So this time of year, assuming the hive makes it through the winter, she'll start laying eggs in her hive, and she'll either lay, just as I mentioned, an unfertilized egg or a fertilized egg. So the unfertilized egg turns into the male bee. So she'll start regenerating the male population right now. And then during the summer, well, here's a question for you. How many eggs do you think she lays a day in the summer when it's full on capacity?
100.
100. Well, it's more like 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day in the summertime. So she's busy. So at this time of year, she's ramping up. So that's how the hive. So they kick the male bees out in the fall, and then now this time of year she'll start some laying the unfertilized tuna males. But then you might ask, well, why do we even need the male bees around in the first place? Well, as I mentioned, their one function is mating. So just to talk a little bit about that, if and the best way to talk about this is to give you an example. So let's say my next hive inspection, and what I mean by hive inspection is I'm actually taking the lid off, I'm lifting out the frames, I'm looking, I'm inspecting, and I do that, well, it depends, but that's what I mean by a hive inspection. So let's say I was doing a hive inspection, and for whatever reason, I accidentally killed the queen bee. Perhaps I didn't see her, I squished her accidentally. What happens is the hive, within about 15, 20 minutes, would recognize, because there's a lot of pheromones, perfume, that kind of chemical, they would recognize in about 15, 20 minutes there isn't a queen bee anymore. So panic would ensue in the hive, and what they would say, okay, well, that's a bit of a problem, but we need to make another queen. So how do they do that? Well, they would run around, scurry around the hive, and they would look for an egg that has just recently hatched, maybe 2 or 3 days, or even a young egg that was just laid maybe 1 or 2 or 3 days ago, and they would play the odds. So, okay, it's this egg over here, this egg over here, this egg over here. These eggs, we are going to designate them as the next queen bees in the hive. So how do they do that? Well, after about 2 or 3 days, the egg hatches into a larvae, and then all larvae in the beginning phases of their life, they get what's called, you've probably heard this term before, royal jelly. So royal jelly is basically a mixture of pollen, honey, and other bee enzymes and things that the bees create. And I mean, it's been well studied. And of course, you can buy it in the store and it'll cure everything that ails you, but that's a whole other story. So these larvae get this royal jelly. Now, all bees, as I mentioned, all the larvae get royal jelly when they start, but these ones that they designated as to be queen bees, they get this royal jelly through their whole larvae stage. And just as another little side point, to give you a sense of how quickly the larvae grow, so in 5 days from after they've hatched to the grown larvae, they're growing at an incredible rate. And the analogy is, in the human terms, if a baby was born, let's say a 9-pound baby boy or girl, in 5 days it would be the size of an elephant. So that's how quickly those larvae are growing, relatively speaking, in the hive. Okay, so the hive has picked these 5, 6 queens, they develop them, and then they emerge as queens. Now, here's where it becomes a little survival of the fittest. So the first queen bee out of that develops and emerges, will go around and kill all the other queen bees because she wants to be the queen. But she's emerged, so she's killed all the other queen bees, but she's a virgin queen bee. So what does she do? Well, this is the one, there's a couple times that a queen bee will leave a hive, and this is one of them. So she needs to go on what's called a mating flight. So she'll fly away from the hive, and as the name implies, a mating flight, all the male bees from that hive and any other hive around, so it's not just those ones, will track her down. And this is why the male bees have super big eyes, relatively speaking, compared to the other female bees. And they'll fly after her and they'll mate with her. And so she typically mates with about 15 to 20 different male bees. And this is the moment of glory for the male bee, because right after they mate if they're lucky enough to mate with a queen, all their bits fall off and then they die. So they die in a moment of glory, so to speak. So she'll go on 1 or 2 different mating flights. And this is how, as I mentioned, I mean, she's born with the eggs, but this is how her sac that has sperm is filled up. So she'll come back to the hive, and then that's when she starts this process of laying eggs. And so in Canada, at least where we live, a queen bee, assuming good health, can live between 2 to 4 years. It depends on a few different factors. So that's, again, sort of a long answer to your question. How do the males, that's their function, is the mating. So in the hive, so we talked about the queen bee. I mean, her main function is laying eggs. The male bees, their main function or purpose of the hive is to mate with a virgin queen. So what do the other bees do? So the other bees are worker bees, or the female bees, and again, they're a queen bee lays a fertilized egg and they emerge as a queen or a female bee. So they go through a couple different phases in their life cycle, depending on their age. So the first thing that they do is they actually clean the cell. So they emerge, and this is the message I was trying to tell my kids. The first thing you should do in the morning when you wake up is clean your room. That goes so well sometimes. But they clean their cell in preparation for the next egg that's coming in. But then they go through that, and then they become what's called the nurse bee. So what that implies is that what they do is they help to feed the larvae that are growing in the hive. And then after about 10 days, they develop glands at the back of their thorax and secretes a liquid, and that liquid turns into the honeycomb that we all know. And that liquid, the honeycomb, is what they build their hives with, and that's you can envision the honeycomb structure. That's what they're building. And then later on, they become defense bees. So what they'll do is they'll line up at the entrance of the hive, and they'll defend the hive from anything that wants to come in. So I remember this one time I watched a wasp land on where the bees enter, and then it walked in, and then in a minute it sort of rolled out the hive like a marble because it was covered in these honeybees defending the hive. And then the last phase of life for a honeybee is the ones that you see on your flowers. These are the foragers. These are the ones going out to collect the pollen, collect nectar. And actually another thing they collect is tree resin, and they bring the tree resin back to the hive, and they use that and they convert it into a substance called propolis. And propolis is like super glue of all super glues. And what they do with that is they seal any cracks in their hive with this propolis to make it airtight for themselves. And then, so during the summer time, this life cycle I just described of a female worker bee is about 6 weeks. So they live at 6 weeks in the summertime. Now that's different than the winter, because in September, going back to the winter scenario, in September, October, the queen bee, October, she's probably stopped by then, but she lays a different kind of bee, basically. It's like a winter bee that is going to get through the winter. But in the summer, the female bee is, the life cycle is about 6 weeks. A couple different scenarios there. In the contamination parts, it's not so much contaminate. Well, two aspects to answer that. One is there's something called robbing. And what they'll rob, for whatever reason, if one hive senses another hive is weak, and a week could be the bees are unwell, or there's just not a large population for whatever reason, then what they'll do is they'll go in there, they'll rob the honey. So they'll go in there, they'll take all the honey out and bring it back to their hive. So it's kind of a robbing scenario. A contamination, well, in that terms, when you bring up that term, I started thinking about infection control issues or pest control. The bane of all beekeepers across the world is something called a varroa mite, which is it's a small pest that it's a bloodsucker. It in human size, in comparative speaking, it's probably about the size of this book. So imagine if I had this book stuck on my shoulder and it was a parasite, it was sucking my blood. I'm probably not going to feel too good. So these varroa mites, they travel with the bees. So in your example of contamination, if there was one hive nearby that had a lot of these varroa mites and some of the bees migrated over to that other hive, in that sense, the hive would be contaminated from an infection control point. But it's more likely the case where I first mentioned is robbing, where one hive is going to the other hive to take their honey. I mean, beekeeping is, if you read everything about beekeeping, the things could kill bees. If you read everything like before you had children, that could kill your children, you never have children. So absolutely, there's lots of things that can be bad for bees. There's lots of infections, there's lots of bugs, parasites, et cetera, et cetera. But where I live, I'm lucky that there's not a lot, there's zero to little agriculture around. So about an hour south of here, Barrie, where there is agriculture, that's where the pesticides and issues can become an issue for beekeeping. But thankfully, I don't have to worry about pesticides from agriculture. What I do need to worry about, though, is where we live is other things like natural predators, skunks, raccoons, and bears. Actually, I live in town, in town, relatively speaking, where I live. We don't see bears often, although we have a few years ago when it was a really dry summer. Bears were in town. It was unbelievable. But people just outside of town, if they have bees, they have to have an electric fence. So we don't have to worry about pesticides per se here. It's more some of those natural predators. And, bears, it's a classic Winnie the Pooh thing where you think the bears are actually after the honey. Of course, they will eat the honey because it's sweet and delicious. But what they're really after is actually the unborn bees, the larvae, because it's a really protein-rich source for them. So that's really what they're after. Of course, they eat the honey because it's like dessert, but the main meal would be the larvae. That's like probably as a result of this pandemic, there's going to be a lot of puppies or cats up for sale afterwards. It seemed like a good idea at the time. I mean, beekeeping, it's not a lot of work, but there is work involved. It is an animal, and it is, it's an insect. In Ontario, it's considered livestock by our rules, by the governing bodies and things like that. So you have to take care of it, and there is some work. It's not a lot of work, but there's some things you need to do, particularly around, I think it's better if I mentioned earlier this varroa mite. Well, this is a real problem for beekeepers. So if for example, someone got into beekeeping because they thought it was a cool idea, I can get some honey, but they didn't take care of the varroa mites, this is a real problem for any of the other beekeepers around them that have bees, and this is their livelihood. Because, back to the question you asked earlier about contamination, this is where a problem can have. Because what happens is then if you buy the bees and you don't take care of these varroa mites, they're going to kill your hive, and it potentially could kill the surrounding hives of beekeepers that are trying to make a living from doing this. So that's where the problem is. There's I think it's out west, there's a beekeeper. I mean, he's got a huge operation, like thousands of hives. But one of the things he does is he puts on these courses regularly for people who are interested in beekeeping to learn about the infectious control part of beekeeping. Because, to him, he's interested in it because he doesn't want a bunch of, first-time beekeepers who wake up one day and think it's a good idea, let's save the bees, but then create actually more of a problem by doing that. So how do you support a bee if you don't want to be a beekeeper? There's a couple things you can do. One is you can plant stuff. That's a good thing. If you can, in wherever you live, if you can, great. If you can't, that's fine too. You can support the industry by buying honey or products from these local beekeepers. So that's a way you can support them. And, yourself or a person not using pesticides too. So there's three practical ways you can support the industry by not getting into beekeeping. Because, if you are interested, it's not like I'm trying to discourage people by any stretch, but just come to understand a little bit about what's involved. Again, it's not a lot of work, but there is some work that you have to be on top of. It's not just set it up and hope for the best kind of thing and get honey for your toast for breakfast kind of thing. That was pretty exciting. So a few years ago, in just a former a job that I had, I worked in our town here. There's a satellite college from it's Canada College, and what we brought there was because we had some space there, we put an apiary there. And it was really, so apiary being a collection of hives, which turned out to be a great community resource for a couple of different reasons. One, I mean, we taught a beekeeping course at Canada, so that was part of our curriculum, which was great. We also tied it into our main campus is a couple hours away, and they have a huge carpentry set up. So we built it into their curriculum. So we got them to make the beehives, the physical wooden boxes and the frames and things like that. So that was kind of fun. So through the curriculum at the carpentry course, they made these beehives that then we could sell, at a discount price to our community. So it was a great experience for that. We also sent up the honey that we got from our hive to the culinary program at the college, which was kind of cool as well to integrate in that. We also used it as a local resource for community. So we'd had many school groups. A bunch of the schools here are within walking distance. So the school groups would walk over. We would do a little, talking presentation first, just to provide a little education about bees, their background, and many of the things that we've talked about today. And then we would go out and look at the bees, and people would have them. We wouldn't open up the hives that I mentioned earlier, but just standing, because you can stand just right beside a hive and watch the bees, and it's sort of like this mesmerizing, hypnotic, soothing Zen experience. Just watching thousands of bees flying in and out of the hive. And then, of course, their favorite part was coming back in, and we did honey tasting. So that was kind of we'd get them all wired up on sugar and then send them back to school. So that was kind of fun. But we did that with a lot of different groups. That's similar kind of format, whether it be the Chamber of Commerce or any. We had a couple of local groups coming just as a fun staff activity. We also were able to use it to create a honey festival here in Parry Sound, which was pretty popular, where we had a couple hundred people come from all around Ontario. So we did a lot of the things I just described. The honey tasting actually was pretty amazing, because we had about 30 different honeys for people to taste, and we had the local honey selection, so local beekeepers, and then we had a little wider Ontario honey selection, and then we had international, because a lot of friends who know I'm in beekeeping, if they've traveled somewhere, they would see a little jar of honey, and they were kind enough to bring me back a jar of honey. So, and not surprisingly, honey is like wine, in that depends on the source, the grapes and things like that, and it does taste very different depending on where it came from. And so and then we also did, just for fun, we did an Airbnb experience where it was bees, birds, and beer. So if someone signed up for this Airbnb experience, there'd be an hour session around birds, and then we do an hour session on bees, and then they would end up down at the local brewery here and try some beer. So that was a fun thing that we did. So it was a great community resource and education piece for our community and beyond, which was kind of fun. So that was my involvement with that. It was great. So in the typical hive, which is those boxes which you've seen some of the photos of, without too much work, a hive would produce about 30 to 40 liters of honey. So that's a lot of honey, especially, I had 2 or 3 hives, so 60 liters, 90 liters of honey is more than one person needs. And so I have a lot of good friends who are happy that I'm a beekeeper, so I just give them a jar. I sell a few jars, but I'm doing it really just for fun and as a hobby. But beekeepers who are in it for, you can make, there's essentially 3 ways you can make money in beekeeping. There's others, but one of them is selling honey, and those producers, they've got thousands of hives, and they would do things a little differently, manage their beehives a little differently, because their goal is to maximize honey production. So there's just a few different things they would do. So that's one way you can make money. The other way you can make money is through pollination. So in Ontario, for example, a lot of bees get shipped out on a truck out east to the eastern provinces, and they're involved with pollination which is for the blueberries. And then the third way you can make money, or primary way, is just by raising bees. So, back to when you originally asked, how do you get them? Well, you become a bee breeder. So those are the three things. So it's, again, I'm giving you always the long answers to your questions, but I mean, each hive can produce about 30 to 40 liters, and that's without much work. And then, but as you also noted, we're just trying to take a little bit. Basically, we got to make sure that they have enough to get through the winter. Hazards are the emotional turmoil that you can have while you're caring about these bees, and I'll say the stress of that. I'm just wondering if they're going to live, if you're going to do everything right. Like my kids for a while thought that I liked the bees better than I like them. So there was a lot of emotional attachment to the bees. Just want to make sure you do the right things and to get them through the winter. I mean, the physical part, I mean, someone, oh, aren't you going to get stung by a bee? Well, yeah, that happens. But I mean, on that note, let's just talk about that for a second. So honeybees, I mean, yes, they have a stinger. Actually, the males do not have a stinger. So that's always fun. Back to when we were the school kids, I would literally grab them, the male bee, and say, here, hold this bee. And you can hold them because they can't sting you. But honeybee, they only sting people under duress, or it's like a last resort kind of kamikaze kind of thing. Because their stinger, it's got a little fish hook on it, like a barb. So when they sting you, their bottom bit falls out, so they die. So again, it's a last resort kind of thing, as compared to like a wasp. And I mean, that's one of the parts of our education is trying to, even that basic differential between what a wasp is and what a honeybee is, and this fundamental difference is stinging. Because a wasp will sting you multiple times, and I think smiles every time it does it. I've been stung by a wasp myself on my foot, and I mean it hurt for 3 days because it was so painful. I've been stung by honeybees, and it's typically it feels like a bad well, if you're getting a needle, there's initial ouch, it kind of hurts, but then it usually goes away in about 10-15 minutes. So I get stung sometimes because when I'm doing the inspection that I mentioned, I'm not wearing gloves. The reason I'm not wearing gloves is because it's easier to feel the frames and things like that, and also for infection control. And if my fingers, like I don't see a bee and I'm accidentally kind of squishing it, it's usually I'm getting stung because of something I did, not because of what the bees are doing. So, I mean, that is some people absolutely have allergies to bees. I thankfully don't. So, I mean, that would be to answer your question of what would be a danger. I mean, if you're allergic, then beekeeping might not be the best thing you want to do. But I mean, you can also still do it if you really wanted to with wearing the right equipment and things like that. So, but I think actually what I said, the first thing is the emotional turmoil, because beekeeping, while we know a lot about beekeeping, part of the frustration, but also the magic and the mystery is what we don't know about beekeeping. And it's that makes it so engaging to be involved with. That's a big question. So it is also just as it's context dependent and country dependent and where you are in the world dependent about how climate change can or cannot affect bees. And I mean, aside from, so to answer your question, I mean, where you potentially could see if essentially it throws off the cycle of the normal cycle of the bees. So, because I often get asked, well, can you put your bees in like a shed over winter, kind of keep them warm? Well, you could, but then what happens is it can potentially throw off their natural rhythm, their natural cycle. So in the global or bigger context of climate change, if the seasons are changing, if the winters are longer or shorter, or they come out of their hive and there's no food around because of the change in the cycle due to climate, if the change is due to climate change, that's how it can potentially throw off the beekeepers. Now, that said, I mean, they're pretty smart little creatures, so they'll probably figure it out. But if their ability to adapt to the new climate is slower than how the climate's changing, then that could potentially be how they'll be affected by the climate change. Well, I haven't planned on doing photo shoots with the bees, but what I do is I'll just show you this. So every time after a client leaves, bring this up to, they get a little jar of honey, and it says headshot honey. So I'm tying in my photography with my clients. So this is honey made from Parry Sound's finest honeybees. So that's how I tied into my photography with regards to doing photo shoots. I mean, I probably not. I mean, I just enjoy taking photos of the bees for fun because it's fun. I have had a few clients, not during the session, but somehow we've talked about beekeeping. I have invited them to come and do a hive inspection with me after, like a couple, whenever it works for me and them. So I've had clients do that, which certainly they've enjoyed. Because I mean, obviously not everyone's interested in bees, but some people really are. And if I can provide that opportunity, that's worked out well. I'm just embracing the moment. I mean, yesterday I had an opportunity to spend some time outside, just putzing around in the garden. It's always very energizing. So it's not, I guess I haven't thought about it in that context of sort of like competing with each other. Really, it's just enjoying the moments when I'm there and embracing both opportunities when I'm doing them. So I don't look at, it's not really a competition in my mind. It's just, being involved with things that I like to do. Beekeeping, I mean, the project is just keeping my bees alive, which is a good starting point, and then just continuing the education process where we're just educating people as best I can about just some basics about beekeeping and thankfully there's another course that's happening that I'll be co-facilitating with. So that's always fun to do. And it's just always a joy to have bees and do the inspection. So nothing really major in that area. From a photography standpoint, it's just continuing to grow my business and making a difference in people's lives and how they feel about themselves. So that's just, I mean, number-wise, it's just doing more photography. I'm hopefully there's this project that I'm hopefully going to be able to do in the fall where it's a complimentary thing, but there's an organization, they work with clients or community members that have they're either born with or have had an accident. They've got something on their face. A facial difference is the term that they use. And, we are working towards providing an opportunity for those people to have their photo taken, which is going to be pretty exciting, but also nerve-wracking as well, because going back to the example I talked about earlier, and to repeat it, people don't like having their photo taken, and especially, I mean, I guess I haven't met them yet, so I don't want to make any assumptions. But if someone does have a facial difference, they may even like having their photo taken less, but maybe they don't. So that's just going to be a really interesting project from all kinds of levels that I hope to be, aside from doing the regular photography stuff that I did. Another thing I did last year, which was, it turned out really kind of magical again, is my mom, she lives in a retirement home here in Parry Sound, and I worked with one of the people there and said, hey, I'll do like resident photo day, sort of like back to the day, if you remember back in high school or school, you had photo day, put on a nice, some clothing and do your hair and do photo day. So we did this for the residents where my mom is a retirement home, and we did about 20 photos. And my wife was with me, which was help with logistics. But there's two elements that were really amazing about it. My wife was able to engage with them a little more just as they were waiting. But I had said, I don't know, do something like ask them a question about their past or something like that. It was just this. So she got these really rich stories about their lives, and then I got to meet them and interact with them a little bit. And there was one lady in particular. She's 100 years old, and she was describing her. She was born in Canada. She went over to England. She met this guy, came back to Canada. And then she was describing the moment of when she was waiting in the harbor in Montreal, I think it was. And she was 20 at the time. So this is 80 years ago because she's 100. she was describing the moment that her boyfriend at the time got off the ship, and the smile that she had on the face, it was like it just was happening that day. Just the joy that it brought to her. So it was some really cool experiences to enjoy with her. And then we took these photos of probably as 20, 25 people. But what was great about it is the families, the feedback that I got from the families, like having a really good photo of their mom or their dad. It was really sort of was part of the reason I was doing it, because a few years ago, I finally wrangled my dad into my studio to take a photo of him. I mean, just for practice, but also to have a good photo of my dad and my mom. And it was shortly after that he passed away. So I always thought, well, you know, people, it just, you know, we don't have a lot of great photos of our parents. So I was really kind of motivated to do that at this retirement home. So again, I'm pretty good at giving you long answers to your questions, but I hope to do that project. So those two projects, aside from the regular sort of headshot business, are things that I hope to do again this year, because they're really meaningful, or I found them to be really meaningful for the people involved. So those are fun to be involved with. I'll say, I mean, I have. It's not like I've never, because during summer vacations, we've gone kayaking on Georgian Bay, and certainly I've always had my camera with me, and I love to take photos of those too. That said, I mean, there's other photographers in Parry Sound here who take way better photos. And like any of the different genres of photography, to become really, I'm still trying to take a good photo of a person. So let alone to take a good photo of a sunset and things like that. I mean, I love taking them for sure. But to really focus on to bring those to life is, I mean, it's just more, well, it's not, I don't want to make it sound like it, it's just time spent on learning how to take a good photo of a sunset. It's not just point and click kind of thing. So I'll say, yes, I love taking those photos, but that's not my focus. I mean, I was just talking to a photographer the other day. He takes photos at nighttime where he's capturing the stars, Milky Way galaxy, you know, having them juxtaposed to a building. And then with that building, then he's, you know, shining lights on the building. So light painting is the terminology. And then just the complexities involved with that, and then bringing it into the behind the scenes editing of layering images, things like that. It was fascinating, but it's mind blowing for me, because it's like, as I said, I'm just trying to take a good photo of a human face, let alone all that stuff. I mean, it's super fascinating, but it's just time, which, you know, maybe down the road, I'll get more into that as I master this craft of headshot photography. For now, I'm just focused on really learning how to take a good headshot of a person. I mean, I send out some basic stuff on you know, how to prepare for a headshot, you know, things around clothing. I mean, at the end of the day, it's your photo, so you can do whatever you want. But I mean, to create some of the better photos, it's a matter of clothing. For example, not wearing plaid, kind of thing, solid colors, not a lot of jewelry. You know, your hair usually as you wear it normally, and makeup for, well, I guess men or women, is just minimal, because my goal is to create an authentic, genuine photo of a person. It's not, I'm not looking to create a photo of, you know, the ones you might see on some cover magazines or fashion magazines. That's not what I'm taking. I mean, and so to answer, so it's just, we give out some, or provide that kind of information, but I mean, it's all right to not want to have your photo taken. I mean, we're 50-50 in the process of creating this, and they're engaged. And I'm here to create the experience, to have the technology and my professional experience, so that at the end of the day, when they meet with the students, they've had a great experience, and, you know, positive experience. They feel good about it, and they've captured a great photo. So it's fun.